it's a firm based in NC, North Carolina, in the States. And what we do is essentially a lot of data science and machine learning, AI related initiatives for pharmaceutical organizations. So what I'd like to do today is sort of give an overview of AI and data in drug discovery. Just a bit about myself to start off. I'm the VP of Advanced Analytics at RxDS. I have over 20 years of experience working in the analytics space. So the way I actually got into pharma is that I used to be at a high frequency trading on the trading floor at Swiss Bank. And I used to be in that high frequency trading analytics space. And what ended up happening was I got into pharma in 2013, and I ended up building a analytics platform using the tools that we had on the trading floor. So eventually what happened was this platform, it was used for everything from RWE to commercial market research, etc. It got relatively popular, and some investors wanted to sort of spin it out and commercialize it. So that's how RxDataScience came to be. Today we have 4 global offices for RxDataScience, 100 plus staff. I think in 4 years it's been a good run. I'm also a published author, so I have books on Amazon, mainly on data analytics and data science with R, multiple research papers that's there on healthcare, and my background is also in analytics academically. So without further ado, I'm going to get into the main subject. So I started off, I've added some examples to start off of AI projects that we have done as a firm. Now, I would like to distinguish between, machine learning and AI. To me, a lot of these projects really fall into the realm of machine learning, because in AI, you're adding another layer of complexity, which is you're not just learning from a training data set, but you're trying to synthesize new output, just as you would in drug discovery, which I'll get to in a moment. So to me, a lot of these really come down to machine learning, and some examples are physician matching. For instance, can you match up physicians with patients? Market mix modeling. If you're in commercial research, then in what order should I send my sales reps to visit physicians? Should I send them emails first? Should I send them, should I send a certain message, etc.? So there's an entire chain of sequence that you can model, which will optimize the returns on your product. Territory alignment, physician similarity. So there's several different ones, that I've outlined in a couple of these slides. What this is really saying is that there's a lot of different use cases that are being done in the real world in pharmaceutical organizations. Again, these are ML related. Now, I'm not going to say all of these are very successful, but it's really promising to see that an industry that I presumably, once that wasn't really that active to the extent finance was, has gotten so much involved with the world of AI and ML. So in healthcare, AI, as I said, has been less prominent, mainly due to certain issues. For instance, regulatory restrictions. There's a huge impediment to research that's caused by the fact that you cannot access certain data sets. If you're in finance, you can get stock market data very easily. Black box. So when you're presenting, let's say, the results of an algorithm, and you're using deep learning, it's very complicated to explain that to, let's say, an FD individual, because it's a black box. You really don't know precisely, like you would if you were doing statistics or econometrics, how the model actually works, or how the output actually is produced. Now, I'm not saying no one will, but it's not as simple as doing, let's say, a panel regression. It hasn't been a major topic in healthcare academia, doubts on the true effectiveness versus existing methods. So this is something we come across time, on and off. Is this really better than what we've been doing for the last 10 years? And lastly, not enough momentum to sustain a long-term interest. Now, today, this ecosystem has started changing. Biotech is the new big pharma. There's retrosynthesis, drug repurposing, biomarker development, small molecules, etc. There's a lot of activity going on which leverage machine learning. And there have been numerous success stories, right? So benevolent AI, Cloud Pharmaceuticals, Numerate, Existentia. So these are some of the firms that have really been in the limelight, a few of them at least, in terms of how they have successfully used AI for their business purposes. Now, what I would be showing here in the next, let's say 20 minutes or so, and then I'll have questions, are split into four sections. So I'm going to talk about the AI methodologies for drug discovery, the challenges to these methodologies, building an organizational AI culture, and finally the AI technologies that are used to implement the solutions. So first off, this is something I presume, if you've been in the industry, if you've been working in this field, many of you are already familiar with it. The drug discovery life cycle, it's non-trivial. It takes 10, 12, 15 years to create a drug. And the first step is discovery and development. So finding a new drug that will treat certain disease condition. Once that's done, now that's a huge step in and of itself, but then you have preclinical research. You undergo laboratory and animal testing. Then there's clinical research. Then there's an FDA review. And finally, there's a post-market, then there's finally post-market safety monitoring, assuming that the product has gotten approved. But what this really means is that if you look at this chart, or rather the slide, um, new drug development is very expensive and lengthy. And the reason is um, there's all these steps. They're not like, it's not like running an algorithm or doing an IT or finance project. When you're making a drug, there's so many considerations in terms of the effect the drug will have across a diverse set of people that you have to take into account. So today, approximately is $2.6 billion, 10 to 15 years of research, and after which it still might not get approved. So what has happened is that the efficacy has gone down. So you're going through 10,000 compounds, of which one will get approved, while the R&D costs have gone up. So in 2010, it cost about $1 billion to make a drug, and the peak sales would be roughly 800 million. In 2018, it was 2 billion, where the peak sales on average is 400 million. So you have the returns that have gone down and the costs have gone up, obviously. So unlike many other um, use cases, such as the ones that I've shown here, right? Patient-doctor matching, patient finder, treatment pathways, medical imaging, seizure prediction, those are not that expensive in terms of executing those projects. What is expensive, or the two areas that are very expensive, is drug discovery, clinical research, or preclinical research. And those are the spaces where I think machine learning, or AI more generally speaking, can be very effective. I'll get to that in a moment. So first, let's see what it takes to create a drug. And what I've really done here is that I presume most of you are already familiar, but nevertheless, I would like to give a quick background as to the genesis of a drug, and thereafter, what are the areas where we can use machine learning or AI to optimize the process of creating the drug. So it always starts out with identifying a disease of interest, whether, let's say, it's headaches. I'm taking a very, very trivial example. Now, the researchers must find a biological target. It's like a root cause analysis, right? You're trying to find, is there a protein or a gene or something on which, if we act upon that root cause, then we will cure this disease condition. Now finding that target in and of itself is a challenge, but once that target is validated, and sometimes you might not have the correct answer, but nevertheless, you have to screen through thousands of compounds as in, let's say, medications or potential medications that may solve that or cure that disease. It's called a lock and key analogy. So you have a target, and it should fit perfectly into that target. So the drug must fit into the binding pocket of the target to have an effect. This is non-trivial, which is why, and it's non-trivial not because you can't find compounds, you may find compounds, but the toxicity, the side effects, there are many other considerations one has to take into account. Now, So target is one thing. The second part is the compounds. The entire molecular space is 10 to the power of 60. It is computationally intractable to scan through that entire, like it's just not practical. So, no one's going to do that. So what pharmaceutical companies do is they're going to have a library of tens of millions of compounds. But what happens is only one in 10,000 that are eventually tested, eventually make it to the R&D pipeline. So using basic research takes years, but what if we can use AI and machine learning to identify candidates? AI and ML is very good at tasks that require iterations, repetitive work, right? So if I have to scan through millions of compounds, I can do that with AI or machine learning much more readily than I can with traditional basic research. I'm not saying it doesn't work at all. I mean, that's how we have been doing it, except that AI and ML just happens to be, presumably or relatively speaking, more optimal. So the first area in drug development, drug discovery, that where we can use AI or ML is drug efficacy. So once a drug reaches a clinical trial, it is found to have lower efficacy. So due to a weak, there could be a weak biological link between the target and the diseases to be treated. So basically what this is saying is that, you found, you've discovered, you've decided on a compound, everything said and done, but then once it's gone into the clinical trial phase, or even before that, you find that there's a weak biological link, like the target, the drug doesn't really solve the problem. There's a mismatch between the target and the disease to be treated. Now, machine learning can be used to find targets with stronger biological link. For instance, I mentioned one of the targets could be genes. So you can go through the entire sets of genes and use AI neural networks to predict targets or sets of genes that can be used. So one of the examples that's here is, in silico prediction of novel therapeutic targets using gene disease association data, predict the drug targets using data on genes known to be associated with diseases. This paper actually go through it. It predicted 1,000 genes as potential new targets. So the second space where, so that's one of the spaces in drug efficacy. The second space where it's useful is virtual screening, by which I mean screening of the compounds. For instance, there are two types. There's a target-based screening, and then there's a phenotypic screening. Target-based is the effect of the compound on the target, example, the protein. Phenotypic screening is the effect of the compound on the whole system as an organism. Now, as I mentioned, there are tens of millions of compounds. So in these cases, machine learning can be used to prioritize which ones you're going to test instead of doing a full-scale expensive lab testing, screening. Now, of course, you're not doing all the tens of millions, but nevertheless, with machine learning, you can get sort of almost like a probability score, like a calibration. So there are many real-world examples on this. I've just cited a couple of them here just to give some examples. Researchers screened 12 million commercially available compounds that treat heart disease, and purchased 200 using machine learning. Of them, 3 compounds advanced to the preclinical and animal studies, and they completed 3 design cycles in 1 year that would otherwise take 6 years. So the conceptual is very simple, and it's a very natural space to use something like AI. Third, and I have 4 examples really. So the third one is high throughput microscopy. So researchers use microscopy to understand the effect of a drug candidate on target. But the human eye cannot always detect very minute changes, and you might need more precision than that can be afforded even with high throughput microscopy. So there are, again, several examples where researchers have used computer vision to precisely measure cell changes that are not readily observable by the human eye, using something called convolutional neural networks. So there are various different types of neural networks. If you think of deep learning, right? So there is CNNs, there's DNNs, there's RNNs, and each of them have their own space. CNNs are basically used for image recognition or computer vision. So if there's a car like Tesla, is going to use CNNs and other ones. But each of these DNNs have their own strengths. If you're doing time series analysis, you'd be using something called LSTM, long short-term memory, and so on. So anyway, in this particular case, CNNs have proved to be very useful. And the last one is the de novo drug design, which really speaks to can we generate new compounds with desired biological properties? So essentially, what this is saying is instead of screening all the compounds, right? You do have this entire library of compounds. Instead of screening all of them, can we just generate new compounds with a desired property? Um, Now, all of these, I'm really just skimming over them, but these are vast subjects in and of themselves. What I've really outlined here is the fact that these are the spaces where you can use machine learning or AI for drug development. In case of generating new compounds, the two of the most common methods that are used are generative adversarial networks, GANs, and reinforcement learning. So you can think of a generator as it creates so you have a training set. A training set is a set of molecules with a toxicity profile. And the generator, the function of the generator is essentially to create synthetic molecules. So it's just creating molecules, right, with a given toxicity profile. What the discriminator is going to do is it's going to estimate how likely the new molecule came from this training set. So it's trying to see, I created a new compound. Does it really, is it similar to a set of known molecules that's there in my training set? And it's sort of a risk reward kind of mechanism that happens like in various other machine learning algorithms. So in generators rewarded when it fools the discriminator is rewarded when it correctly labels molecules. So you'll find in ML a lot of these, a lot of algorithms use these kinds of risk reward mechanism. You get the classification correct, the weight increase. You get the classification wrong, the weights change. So based on that, it's almost going back, going forth, and finally optimize or narrowing down onto an optimal set of parameters. So in this particular case, we're using GANs and RLs to do what's called de novo drug design. Now, there's several different success stories. One that caught my attention, and I've spoken with them at different events, is a firm called Cloud Pharmaceuticals. So they have, of course, there's 10 to the power of 60, as I mentioned, but they use something very interesting called quantum molecular machine learning. Now, I won't get into the details, but they have fairly good literature on their site and so on. But it's an example where you're using not only deep learning, but you're going a step beyond to try and find drugs of interest. Now, all this is well and good, but there are several challenges which are sort of impediments to the process of doing drug discovery using AI. And some of the top ones are, for instance, the gaps in. So I've listed a few, but I've just highlighted some on this side, on the left, to just highlight the main ones. So gaps in understanding of biology or chemistry. There's a lot of literature, there's a lot of talent, but then there's still gaps, especially when it comes to, for instance, how to use AI for these use cases. So when I say there's not enough skilled ML or AI experts, I'm not saying you won't find AI experts, right? So go to any university, you're going to have PhD programs, postdocs, etc., doing AI. But it is the intersection of AI with healthcare, with drug discovery that really is going to make the difference. So you need sort of someone who's interested in AI, but also has a domain understanding. Now that does not always happen. And if you're a scientist in the biospace, chances are you're not really immersed into AI. So there needs to be sort of a meeting of the minds. So that's one. Second, or a third, and fourth are data related issues. For instance, data restrictions, data quality issues, data access, data sharing. So what these really relate to are essentially you can say the data governance part of the entire ecosystem, right? There's so many restrictions or regulations around what kind of data you can use, and who can use them. Even if your organization has the data, you might not be able to access them. There's departmental budgets, of course, but there's also another factor that's sort of related to the other, the expertise that I mentioned. So there's a divide between ML, AI, and domain experts. So domain experts, let's say you're in the healthcare field, chances are you've been using SAS or Stata, and I'm using a very, very trivial example, using SAS or Stata, and you believe in statistical methods. And then comes someone who's done a lot of AI, and the person comes over and says you should be using artificial neural networks. So there is, even though there's a need for a meeting of the minds may be in different places at all times, because one's thinking ANNs are the best way to do it, and the other person's thinking statistical methods are the best way to do it, because each of them in their own rights, in their academic experience or their professional careers, have seen that those spaces work well for that particular use case. And finally, there are regulatory. So that's something every organization would have to overcome. And finally, there are regulatory challenges to using ML for drug discovery. Um, if you're making a new drug and you're spending, let's say, $2+ billion, and the time comes for the FDA to approve it, you don't want to get caught off guard, where the FDA says this is a deep learning algorithm, a neural network. We don't know how many, what you have done, because it can get really, really complicated. You have hidden layers, hidden neurons, you have activation functions. It's all kinds of things. So, and you risk the drug not getting approved just by virtue of the fact that your model is so complex. Never mind how well it works, your model is so complex that the research community has questions around the accuracy, essentially, of that model. So so what scientists tend to do is stay with the safe side, right? So you're going to use your traditional methods of drug discovery. Yes, there's going to be some ML part as well, but it's likely not to form the bulk of the underlying fundamental basis. So those are some challenges. Now, in the next few slides, so that basically what I've done is, I gave an overview of where AI, the high level parts in drug discovery where AI can be used, and thereafter the challenges. Now, but in order to implement AI, even to get the organization or your teams interested, I think it is essential to build an AI culture within the organization. You might already have the resources, you might already have the talent, and so on. But it starts with very simple steps. One is learning the subject, and most often what I find is I work with various pharmaceutical organizations. I work with their ML groups, their AI groups, and I work with their scientists. So one of the biggest challenges that I come across is that it's not that it's not that they're opposed to AI or ML. It's just that there is not enough familiarity or awareness of what AI or ML can do. So there's a lack of clarity, so to speak. In reality, it's not that hard, and there are many different. Today there's just so many courses where you can at least get a flavor of what ML is. And I've done these myself, many years back. It's not hard. It takes time. You put your mind towards it, like 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. By the end of each of these courses, with each of them, you get a better understanding of what ML is about, what are the limitations, and so on. In fact, the top participants on this forum called Kaggle, where you have ML competitions, are not all ML researchers. They're just people who have worked on these problems hands-on. Reviewing the current trends and successes. So seeing, if let's say you want to use AI in your space, understanding what other firms are doing, and how they're using. It's not, you don't always get real world examples, but nevertheless, there's still a lot of news that comes out where you can see what other firms are doing, what other departments that might be similar to yours are doing. And that gives you some idea as to where it can be used. And I can tell you, I've worked with vendors as well, and it's nothing about really vendors, but it's essential to develop your own personal understanding of the limitations and applications of machine learning, because the moment it comes to like anyone can say anything really. So but as a decision maker, you have to have some sense of where it can be really applied and ask those difficult questions when a certain proposition comes forth. And lastly, I often get this question: where can we apply AI or machine learning? Like, is there a space to apply machine learning? And to me, this is such a, it's almost like a trivial thing, because what you're doing in Excel, even the data mining part can be done using machine learning. I mean, you can just call it regression. Essentially, there are ways to introduce machine learning or AI in all types of activities. Um, and it's not as difficult as it might seem to be. Now the results we don't know, right? The results might be almost the same as what you got by doing an average across a certain aggregate. But nevertheless, if anybody wants to introduce AI, apply machine learning in their day-to-day work, it's feasible. There are just some, sort of pointers. One is simple can be powerful, which is, I once spoke with someone who was at Novartis, and he said that the biggest, and he was the head of the AI group, and he said the biggest success they had was when they changed the timing of an email. Instead of sending it out on Monday morning, they sent it out on like a middle of a week afternoon. And he was quite disappointed because he said that made such a huge difference. On Monday morning, yes, it's a huge email, it's making news, but everyone's really busy with the day-to-day work, and they're not really looking into it. I mean, that it doesn't create the required impact. General characteristics: it should be easy to accomplish, have high visibility, and a broad, well-recognized use case. We can use AI for very complex tasks, or machine learning for very complex tasks. But if we cannot explain what we're doing, let's say to in layman terms, so to speak, to someone who has no idea about that field, then I think it has become already too complex to gain a natural traction. And there are many examples. Now I won't have time to get into them, but basically it should be easy to accomplish, have high visibility, easy to explain. And finally, you shouldn't ignore stock analytics, which is the thing that's done on every day, on a repetitive basis, or every week. If we can make those simpler using machine learning or AI, then that can also have an equally important or significant impact. So developing analytics friendly environment, this basically talks about, we should also encourage team members, encourage team users to engage. We should build a culture of AI awareness within the firm, and encourage them to learn in order to make it truly democratize it, so to speak. There are many different technologies. I have personally worked them. So even though so my background has been mainly on the practitioner side, and that I think has been very useful, because once you try all of these hands-on, you get such a innate understanding of what their uses are, where they shine, where they perhaps fall short, right? So anyhow, I won't go too far. I mean, there are many different things here, which I presumably I can share the slides afterwards, that talk of the different AI technologies that can be used and so on. And I would just like to end off by saying, there's a very promising statement, promising saying by Carl Sagan, which says, "Somewhere something incredible is waiting to be known." And I find that very encouraging. We are in the middle of a crisis that just seems to be restarting all over again. And hopefully, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, AI is going to be so far developed that finding a vaccine would be a matter of a couple of months, perhaps. So anyway, so with that, I'd end off. So thanks for your time, and thanks for listening to the entire presentation. So thank you.